In 1970, you could be exposed to a 50, you could have a blood level of 49.9 micrograms and you were okay. You weren't lead poisoned until you were up to 50. And that was the diagnosis. If it wasn't enough to kill you, it wasn't enough to hurt you. But after Dr. Needleman's study, he showed the 5-point IQ drop in the children of Wichita, and they measured their blood level of lead, and it was 10 parts per billion. My, that's a lot lower than the 50, isn't it? And so they began to say, well, you know, 10 is bad. What they're saying today is 2 is bad. You know what? It's better to have none. As Dr. Curry at the Mayo Clinic said, there's no reason to have lead in the blood of children. And the same is true of mercury. We just defeated the advocates for mercury fillings at the FDA for the second time in December, when we showed that using the highest estimate of minimum risk level and the lowest estimate of exposure, that 63 million Americans are overexposed to mercury from their fillings. And the city of San Diego has begun to add a very strange element to the public water supply called hydrofluosilicic acid. Anybody know what that is? Add chemistry, hydro, water, fluo, fluoride, silicic, sand. Who would know that fluoride would stick to sand? Well, it's a very strange molecule. Did you know that hydrocarbon, that's oil. If you take oil and knock the hydrogen off and you put fluoride on, what do you get? Teflon. Well, Gore-Tex. A whole bunch of other elements that are entirely different than oil, aren't they? Well, that's why fluoride is very valuable to industry. How do you get gasoline to turn in from bunker oil, they call it, to kerosene and then gasoline? You break it into pieces. What do you use to do that? Well, you use hydrofluosilicic acid, because fluoride is the only element in the periodic chart that will bind with every other element, including the inert gases, which means we need to change the name of the inert gases. We should call them the almost inert gases. And so hydrofluosilicic acid from China is what San Diego has chosen to medicate its children with. But if you go on the American Dental Association's website, you will see that the American Dental Association, the Center for Disease Control, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and no dental organization on the planet recommends that you dose an infant with fluoride. So they say, well, you know, you can buy bottled water. Well, isn't that a violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act? Why, yes it is. But you know what? The Safe Drinking Water Act does not have the force of law. It's a recommendation. And so we recommend that you don't poison your baby, but on the other hand, we're going to add a substance to the water supply, hydrofluosilicic acid, that has a patent in the United States Patent Office for extracting lead from brass. You understand that? How can this strange and unusual man-made molecule do something that nothing else on the planet will do? Brass? Isn't that what the faucet's made out of? Brass? If you had a cannon left over from the Civil War and you dropped it into a vat of hydrofluosilicic acid, it would take all the lead out of it. There are now 4 major studies with over 450,000 children showing that children who drink hydrofluosilicic acid in the public water supply have a much higher blood level of lead. And they said, well, that's just a bad study, it's probably finger sticks, and they had, you know, poor children that were, you know, touching the paint in their house, and so yada yada yada. So Roger Masters repeated that, only this time with blood from the venous system, and he showed exactly the same thing he had shown in the first place, that the children in general doubled their blood level of lead. Is that a benefit? No, that's not a benefit. Tooth decay is related to the amount of lead in your blood, so it actually increases tooth decay. So what he also showed when he took the data and separated it by racial origin is that children that are generally of African descent had 6-fold increase in their blood level of lead. That's why the African American Pastors Association, Black Pastors of America, have come out opposed to it because it causes disproportionate harm to the African American children. Well, Where are the Hispanic ministers? Because it did exactly the same thing to the Hispanic population, only instead of a 600% increase, it was a 400% increase. That's unconscionable. It really shouldn't be allowed in a free society. But you know what? The reason it's allowed is the same reason that the audience is packed, is that if you allow governments to do what they do, they will always default in favor of where the money is. If you had, let's see, I think there's about 70 trucks of fluoride, hydrofluorosilicic acid, which is raw, untreated, hazardous waste from the phosphate fertilizer mining industries of China, Japan, and Mexico. It takes about 70 of those a month to add the wonderful elixir to our water supply, and it's contaminated with arsenic at a level that causes an additional cancer of bladder or lung per 1,500 water users, lifetime water users. But it takes about 70 of those trucks. So if you had a truck full of that stuff and had to get rid of it, what would you do? Well, if you called the hazardous waste dump, you would find it would cost you more than you're going to earn in the next 10 years to dispose of that. But if you go grease the palms of a few politicians, that you can pay them to add it to the water supply. So it's called dilution, is their solution to the pollution that making phosphate fertilizer causes. What is phosphate fertilizer? It is the byproduct of making nuclear weapons. In 1945, they had tons of it left over because they made nuclear weapons. And now we got a little problem with the nuclear reactors. Same deal, where do they get uranium? You run a bulldozer into a mountain and you pull out tons of uranium. But most of it doesn't blow up. So you've got to separate it. So you actually end up with tons and tons and tons of phosphate. Well, let's tell people it's good for tomatoes, and we'll have these great big tomatoes that don't taste like anything. That's phosphate. It makes the plant thirsty. It's not necessary for the plant. What else do you get? You get gypsum. What are we going to do with that? Let's put paper on